Hi everybody, it's me, Dr. Whimsy, and today I'm covering a topic that is very, very different than what I usually cover, and it's a topic that I've been thinking about for a long time. It's a topic that's very interesting to me. I was rolling around this idea for some time, and it will probably not be done in 10 minutes or less, so I will probably have to do a part 2 and possibly a part 3. This topic has more to do with my undergraduate degree than my doctorate. My undergraduate degree is in anthropology and my doctoral degree is in naturopathic medicine. I think that that's a really cool combination because I get to travel all over the world and study cultures and how various different people throughout the world practice medicine, and I think that's neat. The other thing that I look at is human behavior and what the function is of a given behavior and how we modify this part of us that's human, these behaviors, in a given culture, how a particular culture addresses a particular human trait, so to speak. Today's topic is shame, the emotion of shame, or the capacity to feel shame. And I'm addressing it from the perspective of both being an anthropologist but also being a doctor. So today I want to talk about the function of the feeling of shame, why we feel shame, when it's healthy to feel shame, when it's not healthy to feel shame, what the consequences of feeling shame are, and how we heal shame. Let's see how much I can get through. Let's see how far Dr. Whimsy can get on this subject. Okay, so the first part of this conversation is to talk about what the function of the feeling of shame is. Why do we feel shame? Why do we feel ashamed? Why would we develop an evolutionary trait where we have the capacity to feel shame? What is its function? Its function is to allow us to survive, to help us survive. So the function of shame is it is a survival mechanism. It guides us in how to conduct ourselves in a given culture, what the expectations are in a particular culture for how we are to behave. When we step outside the standards and expectations of that given culture, we are chastised and then we feel shame. This is common in childhood. This is how children are raised. They're raised and they're told when they do something they shouldn't be doing, and then they feel ashamed. They are ashamed of what they did, and then they have to modify their behavior. For example, a child might really want to have a cookie. You're taking the child shopping, and then the child grabs the cookies off the shelf and begins eating the cookies because they really want a cookie, and then you shame the child. You tell the child this is not acceptable behavior. The child becomes upset because their desire is to have the cookie, and then they feel ashamed and confused, and then of course you have to explain to them this is not socially acceptable behavior. So that is the function of shame. It allows us to survive the expectations of a given society. Understanding the function of shame, we then can say that shame is not our enemy, shame is our friend. It does not exist to make our lives miserable. It exists, it's an evolutionary trait that exists as to help us live, to help us survive. We see in some personality disorders, if you look at the DSM-5, the personality disorder known as antisocial personality disorder, commonly referred in popular literature, popular culture as sociopathy, psychopathy. That is a personality disorder where it would appear that the person who has it has an incapacity to feel shame. They have no remorse for what they do. And this is considered pathological. So shame is a healthy response. It becomes unhealthy if we feel shame about things that we have no control over. I also want to talk about the consequences of why we have to feel shame in a given culture. We have to feel shame in a given culture, why it's necessary for us to feel shame when we are chastised. When we are chastised, we feel shame, and that evokes an unpleasant feeling or an unpleasant emotion in us. And we think, oh, I don't want to feel that again, so I'd better modify my behavior. If we are not able to modify our behavior, or if we did not have the capacity to feel shame, we would risk possibly being shunned by that particular culture. An example would be exile, or to be shunned, or to be pushed out of a given tribe, pushed out of a community. A very famous story from the Bible is Moses being put into exile. He's forced into exile, excuse me, where he faces certain death because he can no longer rely on a community or a tribe to help him survive in a harsh environment. And so this fear of exile and death is what drives human beings to have the capacity to feel shame so that they can conform to society and not face exile. The fear of exile is a terrifying emotion. An example of that would be when you don't conform to the expectations that they have for you in your place of employment, and you're called into the manager's office, and that feeling of fear and terror, oh my God, I'm going to be fired, that is the fear of exile, poverty, being cast out, and how will I survive? That same raw emotion you're feeling, or maybe even feeling some shame, wow, I messed up, all comes from this primordial ability to feel shame and a desire to survive. If you took the Hare checklist, Robert Hare has a test that he developed that allows you to find out if you are a sociopath. If you score 25 or higher, in Great Britain you're recognized as a sociopath. In America we're a little bit more lenient, of course. 30 or higher, you're a sociopath. But deviants, people who are not quite sociopaths but are considered deviants, score between 19 and 24. Some people would argue it's 16 to 24. What's interesting about that, what's interesting about deviants, is that artists, forward thinkers, revolutionaries often will score within the category of, say, 16 to 24 on the Hare checklist. They can feel some shame. They may feel tremendous shame, but they still engage in behavior which is deviant. And this requires a kind of internal strength. For example, someone who fights against cultural expectations for their particular group, whether it's persecution against their gender or their race, and despite the fact that there's incredible pressure on them to conform, they continue to fight what they believe is the good fight, and then by going against the grain of a particular culture, they're actually able to make tremendous breakthroughs and push that particular culture forward or help the culture evolve. That is the function of a deviant. So some deviant traits, some capacity to push against shame, actually can be constructive to a given culture. It serves an important function. Martin Luther King would be an example of someone who refused to bow to societal pressures, fought against that, refused to feel shame because he understood that his fight was more important than what was culturally expected, and in that way he actually helped push the culture forward. So I think that that's really important. Artists fall into the category of deviance. Great musicians, they sometimes can be a bit naughty. We know a lot of famous, brilliant artists, musicians, poets, writers, actors doing incredibly cutting-edge work and are very controversial, might even fall into the category of having some types of personality disorders, and yet we also see them as geniuses and brilliant. That is that category. I want to talk about shame in the drug-addicted person as well. When do we see shame as associated with pathologies like drug addiction? And that is an interesting cycle, and I think I'm going to leave it for part 2, which is when we're going to talk about how shame can become pathological and it can become a never-ending cycle. So I'll stop here. If you're interested, you can go on to shame part 2, which is, I think, a really interesting subject. Thanks for watching so far.